The cake was still warm when I wrapped it in foil, pressed a paper napkin against the top to keep it from sweating, and placed it carefully into the floral tin I've had since 1982. I hadn't seen my son in almost a year, not since the wedding. And even then, he didn't look at me the same. It was chocolate his favorite, always has been. I remembered the way he used to sneak bites when he was little, dragging a chair across the linoleum to reach the counter, thinking I wouldn't hear the screech. Now he was grown, married, and farther than ever, even though he only lived 20 minutes away. I didn't get an invitation to dinner. I just decided to go. The door opened. Not wide, just a sliver. Just enough to show me her eyes. Yes, she asked. I smiled. Hi, sweetheart. I just thought I'd drop by. I baked a cake. Chocolate. She stared at the tin in my hands like it was something offensive, like I was offering her garbage. We don't eat your food, she said, flat. Not cruel, just blank. I swallowed. It's just cake, I whispered. She didn't move. No sound from inside. No greeting. No sun. Still, I left it, placed it gently on the welcome mat, and walked back to my car, slow, careful not to let the tears mess with my vision too much. I didn't want to crash. Not with the radio playing the way it was. Soft jazz. The kind I used to hum while making breakfast before school. I thought, maybe, they'd try it later. Maybe it was just a bad moment. Maybe my son would call. He didn't. But I had stories to tell, so I told them to the cake. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, empty tin in front of me, staring at the floral print like it might offer answers. My house was quiet. It had been quiet since Harold passed. That's life, I guess. You build a home, raise a family, and then silence. I went to the store, bought more flour, more sugar, just in case. Hope, I think, lives in grocery lists. On Wednesday, I baked again. Lemon this time. Lighter, brighter. I didn't drop this one off. Instead, I wrapped it up and walked to Mrs. Davenport's house 2 doors down. Her husband died last spring. We never talked much before, but grief speaks a universal language. She cried when I handed her the cake. Said no one had brought her anything since the funeral. We sat in her kitchen, talked, laughed, and when I got home, there was a text from my son. Saw the cake. Thanks. No heart. No smiley face. But it was something. So I replied. Did you like it? No answer. By the 3rd week, I'd baked 5 cakes. 1 for the church. 1 for the librarian who always asks how I'm doing. 1 for the mailman who smiles with his eyes. Every one of them said thank you. Except my son. But I kept baking. People started calling me the cake lady. Some even offered to pay, but I always refused. These cakes weren't for money. They were pieces of me. Warm slices of memory, grief, and hope. My oven became my confession booth. Flour my forgiveness. Sugar my apology. Because somewhere in all that mixing and folding, I was trying to rewrite something. Undo something. Understand how the boy who used to ask for just one more slice, please, Mama, had become a man who couldn't bear the taste of my love. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe I reminded them of what they didn't want to see. Old age. Loneliness. The soft erosion of time. One Sunday, as I was pulling a carrot cake out of the oven, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. No one knocks anymore. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it. It was her. My daughter-in-law. She stood there, holding my floral tin. Clean. Polished. I thought you might want this back, she said. I took it, nodding slowly. She didn't smile. But her eyes weren't blank either. They were tired. I didn't mean to be rude, she added after a moment. I waited. It's just he doesn't talk about you much. I didn't know how to. You don't have to explain, I said gently. Silence. Then, she looked past me, into the kitchen. Is that carrot cake? I smiled. It is. She hesitated. That was my mom's favorite. I stepped aside. She didn't come in. But she didn't leave either. Later that night, I got a call. My son. His voice cracked when he said, Thanks for the cake, Mom. I nearly dropped the phone. Anytime, I whispered. He paused. Can we come for dinner next week? My hands started shaking. I'll make roast chicken, I said. And chocolate cake? I laughed through the tears. Always. Dinner was scheduled for Sunday at 6. By 3, I had already vacuumed twice, wiped the counters down 3 times, and rearranged the living room furniture once, then back again. My nerves fluttered like laundry in the wind. The roast chicken sat marinating in the fridge, stuffed with garlic, rosemary, and lemon slices. I had already made the chocolate cake the night before just in case something went wrong today. It sat on the counter under a glass dome, looking like a monument to all my trying. I wore my nicest blouse. Light blue, the one Harold used to say brought out my eyes. I kept glancing at the clock. 5:45, 5:52, 5:59, 6:01. A car pulled into the driveway. My breath caught. The doorbell rang. I opened the door. There they were, me son, my daughter-in-law, and oh, a little boy, maybe 3 years old, big dark eyes and a soft mess of curls. He clutched a stuffed elephant and hid behind his father's leg. "This is Eli," my son said. My knees nearly gave out. "You never told me," I began, voice cracking. He looked down, suddenly sheepish. "We wanted to keep things quiet. We weren't ready for family." I couldn't speak. I bent down, smiling at the boy. "Hi, Eli," I said softly. He blinked at me, then looked up at his father. "Is that Nana?" My son nodded, and something in my chest broke and healed at the same time. Dinner went well, better than I expected. Eli spilled water twice. My daughter-in-law apologized for everything, even things that didn't need apologizing. My son asked about the rose bush Harold planted out front. Normal things. Kind things. We talked. We ate. We laughed once together. A real, round laugh that filled the room and tasted like old Sundays and new beginnings. And when dessert came out, Eli clapped his hands. He took a bite of the chocolate cake and grinned, cheeks smudged with icing. "It's yummy, Nana." I wanted to cry. "Instead," I said, "I made it just for you." That night, after they left, I stood at the sink, washing dishes by hand even though I had a dishwasher. My hands liked the routine, the water, the warmth. Then my phone buzzed. A picture. Eli, holding up a crayon drawing. 3 people and a cake. Underneath, in crooked letters, it read, "Nana's house." I didn't even realize I was crying until the sink began to overflow. They came again the next week. And the week after. Each visit felt like thawing ice. We moved slowly, carefully, like people learning how to walk again. I never asked about the gap, the years of silence, the awkwardness, the pain, and they never offered. It was enough to be here, together, until one night, my son lingered after putting Eli into the car seat. He stood by the door, looking at me like he used to when he was a teenager about to confess something. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." I paused, dried my hands, looked at him straight. "For what?" He exhaled. "For everything. For pulling away. For not calling. For letting it get so bad." I didn't move. "I was angry after Dad died," he continued. "And you were so strong. So put together. I thought maybe you didn't feel it like I did." I placed a hand on his arm. "Sweetheart," I said, "I've been broken since the moment we buried him. But I had to keep going. For you. For me." He blinked hard. "I know that now," he whispered. Then, just before he walked away, he added, "She didn't mean to hurt you, either. She just didn't know how to fit into this kind of family. This kind. The kind where love comes in the form of too many cookies and unannounced visits." I laughed, really laughed. He smiled. And I knew, in that moment, we were starting over. Spring arrived. My roses bloomed bright pink, brighter than they had in years. Eli loved to help in the garden. I bought him a little trowel and gloves. He'd dig up worms and squeal with delight, running to show me like they were buried treasure. I started teaching him how to bake. "Always crack eggs on a flat surface," I told him. "Why?" "So you don't get shell in the bowl." He nodded like I'd just given him state secrets. We made cookies, cupcakes, banana bread. But his favorite was always chocolate cake. One day, after licking the spatula clean, he looked up and asked, "Can I be a cake grandma too when I grow up?" I smiled. "You can be anything you want, sweetheart." He beamed. And I believed it. Summer came. With it, a barbecue invitation. At their house. It was the first time I'd been invited inside, not just left something at the door, not just dropped off gifts or stood on the porch. This was real. This was a seat at the table. When I arrived, the grill was already sizzling. My daughter-in-law came out with a plate of corn on the cob and really smiled. "I'm glad you came," she said. "Me too." She paused. "I want to say thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up. On him. On us." I looked at her. The woman who once said, "We don't eat your food." And I realized we're both different now. "I used to think love had to look a certain way," she said. "But yours. It's quiet. And steady. Like a heartbeat." I blinked away the sting in my eyes. Thank you for seeing it, I whispered. That night, they brought out a surprise. A cake. Homemade. Slightly lopsided. The icing uneven. But it was chocolate. They'd made it together. For you, my son said, setting it in front of me. Eli clapped. We did it all by ourselves. I cut a slice. Took a bite. It was dry. Too much flour. Not enough oil. But it was the best cake I'd ever tasted. Because it was made with love. And finally, that love had found its way back home. Later that week, I found myself standing in front of a nearly empty shelf in the grocery store. A sign read, "Supply shortage. Limit 1 bag of sugar per customer." I stared at it for a long time, holding the metal cart's cold handle like it might steady the sudden rush of memory. Sugar. I had never thought it would become rare. I reached for a bag, but someone else's hand touched it at the same time. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said quickly. The woman laughed. She was maybe in her 30s, short brown hair, tired eyes. "No worries. You take it," she said, and let go. "You sure?" "Yeah. I'm not really baking for anyone. Just for me. But you look like someone who's baking for love." I smiled softly. "I suppose I am." We chatted a little by the checkout. She was recently divorced. Lonely. Said her name was Melissa, and she lived a few streets over. I invited her for coffee. She came the next day and left with a loaf of cinnamon bread and a new habit of showing up on Thursdays. We became friends, slowly. She helped me set up a little card table at the community center where I donated cakes each week, one to the Widows Club, one to the New Moms group, one to the men who played checkers and claimed they didn't like sweets, but always ate every last bite. Word spread. People started leaving notes in my mailbox. "My daughter is turning 9. Could you make her something with strawberries?" "My wife has been sick. She loves lemon." "I lost my job. Just something small to remind me things can still be sweet." I baked for them all. I found a rhythm in it. Kneading dough while humming old tunes. Watching sugar melt into butter. The smell of vanilla folding into the warm air of my kitchen. It felt like prayer. It felt like healing. It felt like living again. One afternoon, while I was frosting a red velvet cake, Eli burst through the back door with a construction paper crown sliding down his forehead. "Nana," he shouted, "we're doing a family tree at school. I need to know your favorite color." I laughed and wiped my hands on my apron. "Blue," I said. "Like your blouse." "Exactly." He scribbled on his little worksheet with the intensity of a scholar. Then he looked up, serious. "What do you want to be remembered for?" I blinked. "That's a big question, sweetheart." He waited. I sat down at the table beside him, looked out the window at the roses. The same ones Harold planted when we first moved in. "I want to be remembered for trying," I said finally. "For showing up, even when it was hard." He nodded like he understood. And maybe, in his own way, he did. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at the community center. Me, a speaker. Melissa introduced me. She said, "This woman taught me that food can be a bridge. And sometimes, when the heart is too bruised to speak, a warm slice of cake says everything." I stood at the microphone, hands trembling, heart pounding. I told them my story, not all the details, but enough. Enough for them to understand that my cakes weren't just desserts. They were bandages, apologies, open doors. "When my husband died," I said, "I thought I'd never feel whole again. And then, when my son pulled away, I thought maybe love had an expiration date." The room was quiet. But I was wrong. Love waits. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes in crumbs. But it waits. There was a pause. And then a long, warm round of applause. That night, I found another note in my mailbox. Written in shaky handwriting, barely legible. "My wife passed last fall. We were married 61 years. I don't go out much, but I heard about your cakes. She used to make peach cobbler. If you ever have the time." It wasn't signed. No return address. Just a house number. The next morning, I peeled the ripest peaches I could find, sprinkled them with brown sugar and cinnamon, and baked them into the softest cobbler my old hands could manage. I left it on the porch with a note that said, "She would be proud of you for remembering her." The tin came back empty the next day. By early autumn, I'd baked over 100 cakes, each one with someone's name on my heart. My daughter-in-law started helping me sometimes. She brought her own recipes, added new spices to mine. We bickered about salt and laughed about it later. She began calling me Mom without hesitation. One afternoon, While the oven was preheating, she asked, "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" I paused, measuring flour. "Sometimes," I said, "but if they had, I might not have become who I am now." She looked down, biting her lip. "I judged you," she said quietly. "Back then, I thought you were overbearing, controlling." I chuckled. I probably was. But I didn't see it came from love. It just felt like pressure. "I get it," I said gently. "You were protecting your space, your new family, and I was mourning the one I felt slipping away." She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw understanding. Not just truce. Connection. "I'm glad you stayed," she whispered. "So am I." One day, my son brought over an old box of photos. He found it in the attic. Inside were snapshots of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, chocolate-covered toddler faces, and a much younger me, flour on my nose and a baby on my hip. We sat at the kitchen table and sifted through them together. Eli leaned over, pointing at each one. "Is that me?" "No," I laughed. "That's your daddy when he was just a baby like you." He gasped. "But he's so little." My son smiled. "We all were once." Then he handed me a photo I hadn't seen in years. It was Harold, in the backyard, holding a cake I'd made for his 60th, laughing with his whole face. "I miss him," my son said. "So do I." There was a pause. Then he added, "He would have been proud of you." The words hit me deeper than I expected. "Thank you," I whispered. That night, I sat alone on the porch, sipping tea and watching the stars blink into the sky. The house behind me was warm, lit from the inside with the echoes of dinner and dishes and stories. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just visiting the past. I was building something again. Something soft and human. Something that tasted like sugar and salt and second chances. October came with golden leaves and chilly mornings. The kind of mornings where your breath fogs up the window as you wait for the kettle to boil. I liked those mornings. They reminded me of Harold, how he used to bring me a blanket before I even realized I was cold. One of those mornings, I got a call from the local senior center. "We heard about your cakes," the voice said. "Would you be willing to do a baking workshop for the residents?" Nothing fancy, just something warm. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, but because I hadn't stood in front of a group since, well, forever. But something inside me said yes. When I arrived that Friday afternoon, the rec room smelled of dust and liniment. Half the crowd was dozing in their wheelchairs. The other half eyed me like I was interrupting their bingo. But the moment I started measuring out flour, something changed. They watched, asked questions. One woman even offered a tip about how her mother used to separate egg yolks using the shell instead of a spoon. I smiled and said, "I still do that." By the time the cupcakes were in the oven, the whole room was buzzing like a little hive of warmth and memory. We all leaned in to breathe the scent as it filled the room. "Smells like my wedding day," one man said softly. "My grandma used to make these when I had measles," another woman added. They weren't just remembering cupcakes. They were remembering their lives. When the timer went off, I served each person a little paper-wrapped cake. Some couldn't hold it steady, so I fed them bites with a spoon, like you would a child. One woman took my hand and said, "You don't know what this means to me." But I did. I did. The community center offered me a regular spot after that. Friday afternoons. They called it Baking with Miss Evelyn. I laughed at the name, but deep down, I loved it. Eli started calling it my cake job. "Do you get paid, Nana?" he asked. "No," I smiled. "But I get hugs." He wrinkled his nose. "That's not money." I ruffled his hair. "It's better." One Tuesday, I opened my front door to find my son standing there alone. No Eli. No cake tin to return. Just him. He looked pale, like he hadn't slept much. "I need to talk," he said. I stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the old clock on the wall like it might offer him courage. "I got a call from the doctor," he said. "They found something in my scans." My heart stopped. He went on. "They don't know if it's serious yet. I'm doing more tests next week." I reached across the table and held his hand. "When your dad got sick," I said quietly, "we didn't talk about it. We just hoped it would go away. And when it didn't, we were all left wondering why we hadn't said the things we needed to." He nodded, eyes glassy. "I'm not going to do that this time," he said. "I want you to be part of it. Whatever this is." I squeezed his hand. "I'm here," I whispered. "No matter what." Waiting is a strange thing. You try to keep busy, clean, bake, Fold laundry that doesn't need folding but your mind keeps circling back. The test came back 10 days later. Benign. Just a cyst. Nothing dangerous. When he called to tell me, I collapsed into the kitchen chair and laughed so hard I cried. He laughed too. I didn't realize how scared I was, he said. I did, I replied. I've been scared for you since the day you were born. He paused. Then, softly, I don't say it enough, but thank you for everything. Even when I didn't deserve it. I smiled through tears. You'll always deserve it. You're my son. That Christmas, I hosted dinner. A full table. Candles flickered, pine-scented garland curled across the mantel, and everyone brought something. Melissa brought her famous mashed potatoes. My daughter-in-law made a sweet potato casserole that had everyone asking for the recipe. Eli wore a Santa hat and sang off-key carols while handing out candy canes. And in the center of the table was the chocolate cake. My cake. Only this time, I hadn't baked it. My son did. It's not as good as yours, he admitted, sheepish. I took a bite. It was dry, the icing too thick. But I smiled. It's perfect. In January, the local paper did a story on me. The cake lady who brought a town back together. It felt strange, seeing my face in print. But also nice. At the bottom of the article, there was a quote they pulled from my interview. Love doesn't always come wrapped in words. Sometimes, it comes warm from the oven, smelling like cinnamon and home. I cut it out and stuck it on the fridge. Eli read it every time he came over. That's about you, right, Nana? It's about us, I said. One afternoon in early spring, my daughter-in-law and I were sitting in the garden, pruning roses. She turned to me and said, "We're thinking of having another baby." I dropped the shears. Tears welled up before I could stop them. She reached for my hand. "We'd want you to be part of it all. From the start." I nodded, speechless. That night, I opened my old recipe box and pulled out the card labeled First Birthday Cake. It had frosting smudges on the corner from 30 years ago. I smiled. Life, I thought, is a loop. Not a perfect circle but a spiral. It brings us back to places we thought we'd lost. Only this time, with more grace. More softness. More love. Spring turned into summer quietly, like a breath exhaled. The town was blooming, flowers in baskets hanging from porches, kids riding bikes down sidewalks chalked with pastel hearts and hopscotch grids. It reminded me of the years when my son was small, when everything felt fragile and full of promise. One morning, while I was whisking eggs for a new lemon vanilla recipe, my phone rang. It was my daughter-in-law. She was whispering, "We're at the doctor's. Just heard the heartbeat. Thought you might want to know." I froze, the whisk still in my hand, batter dripping slowly into the bowl. "You're pregnant?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Yes. It's early, but it's real." And then, almost like a secret, "You're going to be a grandmother again." I don't remember what I said. I only remember sinking into the kitchen chair and pressing the phone to my chest after the call ended. Another heartbeat. Another chance. I began knitting again. Tiny socks. Blankets in pale yellows and soft greens. I found a box of old baby clothes in the attic, my son still folded, still smelling faintly of baby powder and thyme. I washed them all, hung them on the line, watched them sway in the breeze like little ghosts made visible. When I brought them over, my daughter-in-law cried, held them to her chest, and whispered, "Thank you." She'd started calling me Mom out loud now, even in front of others. I never corrected her, because somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being strangers and started becoming something more like family. Eli had questions, of course. "Will the baby be loud?" "Yes," I said. "Will it cry a lot?" "Probably." He frowned. "Can it still eat cake?" I laughed. "Not right away." He paused, deep in thought. "Okay, I'll wait." As her belly grew, so did our closeness. I drove her to appointments, rubbed lotion into her back, taught her the lullabies I once sang when the nights were too long and the silence too sharp. One evening, while folding laundry in the nursery, she looked at me and said, "I used to think motherhood would make me feel trapped." I waited. "But watching you," she continued, "I realized love isn't a cage. It's a doorway. You just have to be brave enough to walk through it." I didn't say anything, just reached over and took her hand, because sometimes silence says more than words. Then one night, the call came. She was in labor. My son's voice was breathless, panicked. "She wants you there. She said she can't do it without you." I didn't even grab a coat. Just keys, slippers, and the prayer I'd been saving for years. At the hospital, everything was a blur of machines and nurses and pain. I stood at her side, gripping her hand as she screamed and wept and laughed all at once. And then a cry. Tiny, sharp, alive. A baby girl. They named her Grace. Later, when the room had quieted and the nurses had left, my son leaned over and placed her in my arms. I looked down at the warm bundle of life and thought of all the cakes, all the tears, all the silences that had led to this moment. Welcome, I whispered. You're already so loved. The days that followed felt dreamlike. I was over at their house almost every day, helping, cooking, holding little Grace as she squirmed and yawned and lashed her tiny fingers onto mine like she never wanted to let go. One morning, my son walked into the kitchen, bleary-eyed, holding an empty coffee mug. Mom, he said, you've always been here, even when we didn't ask, even when we didn't deserve it. I looked up from the eggs I was scrambling. It's what mothers do. He walked over, kissed the top of my head. I hope I'm that kind of parent. You already are, I said. We threw a party for Grace's 1-month milestone. Just close friends and neighbors. A few aunts and uncles. Some from my cake circle at the senior center. And I, of course, made the cake. It was vanilla, soft and spongy, with buttercream roses piped along the edge. In the center, written in delicate loops of pink icing. Welcome, Grace. Eli stood next to it proudly and announced to everyone. My Nana made this. She's the best baker in the world. The room applauded. I blushed. I smiled. But it wasn't about the praise. It was about the circle. How life had come around again. How the door that had once been closed was now open. Wide. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. From a woman I didn't know. She wrote, Dear Evelyn, my father lives at the senior center. He told me about your cakes, how you feed not just their bodies, but their hearts. I run a program for foster youth aging out of the system. We try to teach them life skills, but what they really need is warmth. Would you consider coming by? I know it's a lot to ask, but maybe, if they had someone like you, maybe they'd believe love doesn't have to come with conditions. With hope. Claire. I read the letter 3 times. And then, I packed up my recipe box. The foster house was small, with peeling paint and tired furniture. But the kids they were fire and noise and cynicism wrapped in too thin armor. They didn't smile when I walked in, but they watched. I brought cookie dough and let them scoop it themselves. Some rolled it into balls with practiced ease. Others squished it between their fingers like clay. One boy ate the dough raw and grinned like he'd gotten away with something. We talked, laughed, argued about the best kind of frosting. And when the cookies came out warm and golden, I handed each one a napkin and said, No matter where you came from, you deserve something sweet. One girl looked at me and whispered, Even me. I met her eyes. Especially you. I started visiting every Tuesday. They called me Miss C, at first as a joke, then with affection. I taught them how to bake, yes. But mostly, I showed up. That's what they needed most. Someone who showed up. One afternoon, a boy named Marcus handed me a paper. A poem. It read, Some people bring cake. Some people bring hope. Some people stay when others go. Some people aren't people. They're magic in disguise. Thank you for being magic. I cried the whole drive home. Time kept moving. Eli grew taller. Grace began crawling. My knees ached a little more each morning. But I kept baking. Because baking was how I prayed. Baking was how I loved. Baking was how I remembered. And how I'd be remembered. On my 75th birthday, my family surprised me with a gathering at the community center. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, Claire, even some of the kids from the foster house, everyone was there. There was a giant cake. Not made by me. Made for me. Frosted with little sugar roses. And in the center, to Evelyn, who never stopped loving. I stood there, surrounded by generations of people whose lives had been touched by something as simple as Secreta's flour and butter and belief. I didn't make a speech. I didn't need to. Because every hug, every tear, every smile said what words never could. Later that night, as I sat alone in the quiet of my kitchen, I thought back to that first cake. The one I left on the porch. The one they didn't want. And I realized that cake wasn't wasted. Because it was the first stone in the path back to them. Back to myself. Back to a life worth tasting. I looked down at my hands. Wrinkled. Flowered. Sacred. And I whispered. Still, I left it. And I always would. Because love doesn't wait to be invited in. It shows up. It knocks anyway. And sometimes, it leaves a cake behind.